Officer Michael Calhoun's face drained of color as District Attorney Victoria Bennett's name flashed on his cell phone. 20 minutes ago, he'd handcuffed her twin daughters on the sidewalk, ignoring their pleas and mocking their lies about their identity. Now his 18-year career was hanging by a thread. Before we dive into this powerful story about prejudice, accountability, and transformation, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If you've ever witnessed or experienced racial profiling, hit that like button to show solidarity with those affected by this ongoing issue. Don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking stories that shine a light on social justice issues in our communities. Now let's rewind and see exactly how Officer Calhoun's misguided assumptions led to a moment that would forever change multiple lives and an entire police department. Officer Michael Calhoun adjusted his sunglasses against the bright spring sunshine as he guided his patrol car through the tree-lined streets of Hillcrest, the wealthiest neighborhood in Oakwood. The 42-year-old veteran cop had transferred to this precinct just 6 months ago after 15 years, working in the city's rougher eastern districts, and he still hadn't fully adjusted to the manicured lawns and sprawling estates that made up his new beat. The pristine sidewalks and carefully maintained flower beds felt almost foreign after years of patrolling areas with boarded-up storefronts and crumbling infrastructure. Still, Calhoun took pride in his role keeping Hillcrest safe, which in his mind primarily meant ensuring that people who didn't belong were promptly questioned and removed if they couldn't provide a satisfactory reason for their presence. As he cruised past Westridge Academy, an exclusive private school where annual tuition exceeded $30,000, Calhoun noticed 2 black teenage girls walking along the sidewalk. They wore the school's distinctive navy blue and gold uniforms, pleated skirts blazers with embroidered crests, and polished shoes that marked them as students of the prestigious institution. Jasmine and Zoe Bennett, 16-year-old identical twins with neatly braided hair pulled back into matching ponytails, were heading to a nearby cafe to study after debate team practice. Their animated conversation about the upcoming Model UN competition, where they would be representing France, was punctuated with laughter as they carried expensive backpacks and textbooks. Calhoun's brow furrowed as he watched them through his window. In his mind, these girls didn't match his image of Westridge students, despite their uniforms and the school's proximity. Without conscious deliberation, he made a U-turn at the next intersection and slowly followed them for a block, observing their body language and movements with the scrutiny he'd developed during years of proactive policing in the high-crime areas. His suspicion, formed without evidence but rooted in deeply held biases, led him to pull alongside the girls and roll down his passenger window. "You two, stop right there," he called out in the authoritative tone he'd perfected over years of police work. The girls paused mid-conversation, startled by the command. Their expressions shifted quickly from confusion to wariness, as they exchanged a knowing glance that communicated volumes between them. This wasn't the first time they'd been profiled, and they both recognized what was happening. Calhoun parked his patrol car and stepped out, his right hand resting near his weapon, in a stance that projected authority, but also implied potential threat. "I'm going to need some identification and an explanation for why you're in this neighborhood," he stated firmly, approaching the girls with the cautious posture he'd use when confronting potential criminal suspects. The twins maintained perfect composure, despite the immediate tension of the situation. "We're Westridge students heading to Bloom Cafe to study," Officer Jasmine explained politely, her voice steady, as she reached slowly for the student ID in her blazer pocket. Calhoun immediately tensed at her movement, his hand shifting closer to his weapon. "Freeze," he ordered sharply, his voice escalating to a volume that attracted attention from people walking nearby. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Jasmine immediately complied, raising both hands slightly while explaining, "I was just reaching for my school ID, sir." After directing her to retrieve it with exaggerated caution, Calhoun examined both twins' student identification cards with obvious skepticism, turning them over and holding them up to the light as if searching for signs of forgery. Despite the school's distinctive holographic seal and matching photos, "Girls like you don't go to Westridge," he said dismissively as he handed the cards back, the implication of his words unmistakable. Zoe, slightly more outspoken than her sister, raised an eyebrow. "What exactly do you mean by girls like us?" "Officer," she asked, directly challenging his assumption while maintaining a respectful tone. Her question clearly agitated Calhoun, whose expression hardened. "Just sit down on the curb while I verify your story," he he ordered, gesturing to the sidewalk's edge, as if directing criminals at a crime scene. The confrontation had begun attracting attention, with several passers-by slowing to observe the interaction. Among them were Westridge parents who recognized the Bennett twins, but hesitated to intervene, uncomfortable with challenging police authority, even when witnessing potential misconduct. Calhoun called in the girls' names for verification, informing dispatch he was investigating possible truancy and trespassing despite their school uniforms and identification. When Zoe attempted to call their parents as the situation escalated, Calhoun immediately confiscated both their phones, claiming he needed to secure them as potential evidence, a justification with no basis in actual police procedure. Throughout this escalating situation, the Bennett twins remained remarkably composed, having been carefully instructed by their parents about exactly these scenarios. Their dignified responses and articulate questioning of Calhoun's actions seemed to further agitate the officer, who appeared increasingly determined to assert his authority. "My mother is District Attorney Victoria Bennett Jasmine," informed him calmly as he continued questioning them about their real reason for being in Hillcrest. Calhoun laughed dismissively at this claim, his disbelief obvious. "Sure, and my dad's the president," he mocked clearly, considering this a desperate lie from teenagers attempting to evade consequences. Despite growing protests from bystanders, including a Westridge teacher who recognized the twins and attempted to confirm their identities, Calhoun proceeded to handcuff both girls, citing obstruction and providing false information to a peace officer. His body camera recorded the entire interaction, every dismissive comment, every unfounded accusation, and every composed, articulate response from the teenagers that contradicted his assumptions about them. The mounting evidence that he was making a serious error seemed invisible to him, as he focused solely on confirming his initial suspicions. His radio crackled repeatedly with requests from dispatch to verify his actions before proceeding further calls he deliberately ignored, as he requested a patrol car to transport the girls to the station. The situation had fully escalated when Calhoun's phone rang with his sergeant's direct number. He initially ignored the call, but when it immediately rang again, he reluctantly answered. His expression transformed from confident authority to shocked realization as he listened to the voice on the other end, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. Sergeant Patricia Rodriguez's voice came through Calhoun's phone with unmistakable urgency. "Mike, verify who you've detained immediately." Now, the unusual tension in his normally unflappable supervisor's tone cut through Calhoun's certainty like a knife through butter. He stepped away from the handcuffed twins, turning his back, as if this physical distance might somehow shield them from hearing the conversation about to unfold. "Just some truant kids claiming to be Westridge students," he responded with lingering confidence, his voice lowered but still audible to those nearby. "Caught them trespassing in Hillcrest. They've got fake IDs," and Rodriguez cut him off mid-sentence. "Those are District Attorney Bennett's daughters, you idiot. Release them immediately. The DA is already on her way to your location." The words hit Calhoun like a physical blow, his world tilting as he processed this information. He turned slowly to look at the twins with new eyes, suddenly seeing their composed demeanor not as defiance, but as the confidence of young women who knew exactly who they were and what rights they possessed. His mind raced through the interaction, recalling every dismissive comment, every baseless assumption he'd made, all captured on his body camera for inevitable review. The realization that he had handcuffed the district attorney's daughters on a public sidewalk without cause sent a cold wave of fear through him that had nothing to do with concern for their well-being and everything to do with his career prospects. As this reality sank in, a sleek black SUV with government plates screeched to a halt nearby, the vehicle's sudden appearance drawing attention from the growing crowd of onlookers. Victoria Bennett emerged from the driver's side, a formidable black woman in her early 50s, wearing an impeccable charcoal suit that radiated authority. Her expression was a controlled mask of fury as she surveyed the scene before her, her handcuffed daughters sitting on the curb, while a white police officer stood nearby looking increasingly uncomfortable. She wasn't alone. Her chief of staff emerged from the passenger side, while the Oakwood Police Department's internal affairs director, whom she had called en route, arrived in a separate vehicle moments later. Calhoun fumbled with the handcuff keys, suddenly desperate to undo his mistake before the district attorney reached them. His earlier smugness had evaporated, entirely replaced by barely concealed panic. The crowd of onlookers, now numbering over 20 people, parted for Victoria Bennett like water, Many had their phones out recording the unfolding scene that would soon populate social media platforms across the city. Victoria didn't acknowledge Calhoun, initially going straight to her daughters, checking them for injuries, and speaking to them in hushed tones. Only after ensuring they were physically unharmed did she turn to face the officer, her controlled voice carrying clearly to everyone present. "Officer, I believe you owe my daughters an explanation and then an apology." Calhoun stammered through a weak justification about protocol and reasonable suspicion, each word sounding more hollow as he spoke them aloud in front of the composed district attorney. Victoria listened without interruption, her silence more damning than any outburst could be. When he finished his rambling explanation, she simply asked, "And what specifically made you suspicious of my daughters, Officer Calhoun?" The directness of the question left him without prepared response. Unable to articulate any legitimate reason that didn't reveal his prejudice, Calhoun fell back on procedural language about unfamiliar persons in the area and recent reports of trespassing. Each excuse withered under Victoria's steady gaze, which betrayed neither the anger she surely felt nor any acceptance of his flimsy justifications. The Internal Affairs Director, Captain Marcus Washington, stepped forward to request Calhoun's body camera footage be uploaded immediately. When Calhoun hesitated, Washington reminded him that delaying or tampering with the footage would constitute additional violations that would only compound his already precarious situation. As the confrontation unfolded in the bright spring sunshine, Calhoun's mind flashed back to his academy training, where instructors had warned about the dangers of biased policing. The memory surfaced of Victoria Bennett at a department training session years earlier, discussing proper procedures for juvenile stops, a presentation he had attended but clearly failed to internalize. Meanwhile, Victoria's mind traveled back to a very different conversation, the one she'd had with her daughters when they started at Westridge Academy 2 years ago. She had sat them down for the talk, not just about police interactions, but about navigating predominantly white spaces while black. "You'll have to be twice as good to get half the credit," she had told them, her expression serious as she imparted wisdom born from personal experience. "And when, not if, but when, you're confronted by authority figures who see your skin before they see your humanity, remember your rights, but also remember your safety comes first." The twins had followed her advice perfectly during this encounter, remaining calm and non-confrontational, while still asserting their identity and rights. Their dignified response stood in stark contrast to Calhoun's increasingly desperate attempts to justify his actions as the professional consequences of his choices became clearer with each passing moment. Victoria instructed her daughters to go with her chief of staff to the car while she had a private word with Captain Washington and Sergeant Rodriguez. As the twins walked away, Calhoun overheard Victoria saying, "I want his body cam footage secured immediately, and I'll need the names of every officer who's had similar complaints." The implications of her words sent another chill through him. This wasn't going to be treated as an isolated incident, but potentially as part of a pattern that could affect not just him, but the entire department. Sergeant Rodriguez approached Calhoun with an expression that combined disappointment and anger. "You're being placed on administrative leave, pending investigation," she informed him flatly. "I need your badge and service weapon." Now, this public surrender of the symbols of his authority was unusual. Typically, such actions would occur at the station rather than in the field, and the deviation from protocol made clear the seriousness of the situation and the department's desire to demonstrate immediate action. As Calhoun unhooked his badge and unholstered his weapon, a memory surfaced from his police academy days 20 years earlier when an instructor had warned the class, "Your badge isn't power, it's responsibility. Abuse one, and you lose both." 2 decades later, those words finally resonated as he watched his career crumbling before him over a stop that had lasted less than 15 minutes, but would have repercussions that would echo through the rest of his life. The part ends with Calhoun sitting alone in his personal vehicle, having been prohibited from using his patrol car to return home. His phone buzzes with a text from his wife. "Elena, why are there videos of you trending on social media?" Looking up from the message, he sees several bystanders still recording their phones, pointed directly at him as he realizes this incident won't stay contained within departmental channels. His actions will be judged not just by his supervisors, but by the entire community, with his name and face attached to what was quickly becoming a viral example of racial profiling. By evening, video clips of the incident had spread across multiple social media platforms with the speed and intensity of a wildfire. Hashtags like number Oakwood police bias and number the DA's daughters trended nationally, with footage showing Calhoun's dismissive treatment of the Bennett twins juxtaposed against their composed responses. News vans lined the street outside the Oakwood Police Department headquarters, their satellite dishes extending skyward as reporters prepared for live broadcasts during the evening news cycle. Inside the building, Chief Thomas Reynolds, a black man who had risen through the ranks over 30 years of service, stood before a hastily arranged podium to address the gathered media. His expression revealed the strain of managing a crisis that threatened to undermine years of community relations work. "The behavior displayed today does not represent our department's values or training," he stated, his deep voice carrying authority despite the difficult circumstances. "We've placed Officer Calhoun on administrative leave, pending a full investigation, and we're cooperating fully with the independent review being conducted by the District Attorney's Office and Internal Affairs." The carefully worded statement did little to satisfy the reporters, who shouted follow-up questions about departmental patterns, bias training, and whether this incident reflected deeper problems within the force. Miles away from the press conference, Michael Calhoun sat in stunned silence in his living room, watching the coverage with his wife Elena and their teenage son Dylan. The television screen displayed his name and badge number beneath footage captured by bystanders' phones, the images more damning with each replay. Elena, a nurse who had supported his police career through numerous difficulties over their 17-year marriage, paced behind the couch, struggling to reconcile the man she knew with the officer in the videos. "What were you thinking, Michael?" she asked repeatedly, her expression shifting between concern for their future and disappointment in his actions. Calhoun had no satisfactory answer, his usual confidence replaced by a hollow feeling as he watched his professional reputation disintegrate in real time. Beside him on the couch, 15-year-old Dylan remained unnervingly silent, his expression revealing a new uncertainty about his father that cut Calhoun deeper than any verbal criticism could. The boy had grown up proudly, telling friends about his police officer dad, wearing Oakwood PD t-shirts to school and defending law enforcement in classroom debates. Now he sat with his shoulders hunched occasionally, glancing at his phone where classmates were undoubtedly discussing his father's sudden infamy. Meanwhile, at the Bennett household across town, Victoria held a family meeting with her husband, Dr. James Bennett, a prominent cardiologist who had rushed home from the hospital upon hearing about the incident and their daughters. Rather than dwelling on the trauma of the experience, Victoria focused the conversation on next steps and broader implications. "This isn't just about you two anymore," she explained, her prosecutor's mind already mapping out strategies and potential outcomes. "Officer Calhoun has a history of similar incidents that were swept under the rug. If we don't address the systemic issues, nothing changes." The twins shared their conflicting emotions about suddenly becoming the center of public attention: anger at being profiled, satisfaction at standing their ground, but also concern about becoming unwilling public figures in a racial justice battle they hadn't chosen. James, typically the family peacemaker who balanced Victoria's strategic intensity with compassionate pragmatism, expressed rare anger as he reviewed the footage on his tablet. "You shouldn't have had to be perfect just to be treated with basic dignity," he told his daughters, his voice tight with emotion. "The burden of proof should never be on the innocent." The family's discussion was interrupted repeatedly by calls and messages from community leaders, civil rights organizations, and even the mayor, all wanting to align themselves with the Bennett family's cause. Victoria skillfully navigated these political waters, making clear to each caller that she was pursuing this case for justice, not publicity or political advantage. Her years as a prosecutor had taught her the difference between meaningful action and performative outrage, and she had no interest in the latter. Back at the police department, Internal Affairs Captain Washington and Sergeant Rodriguez reviewed Calhoun's personnel file, revealing a pattern of complaints about racial bias that had been dismissed or downplayed at his previous precinct. 3 excessive force complaints involving minority suspects in the past 5 years, Washington noted, flipping through the documentation, all ruled unfounded despite witness statements supporting the complaints. Rodriguez, who had only supervised Calhoun for 6 months since his transfer to Hillcrest, expressed frustration at not recognizing the warning signs earlier. His arrest statistics showed racial disparities, but they weren't flagged because his overall numbers were strong. She admitted recognizing how performance metrics could mask problematic patterns. The system protected him until he targeted someone with power to fight back. The next morning, Calhoun received an official notification of the Internal Affairs investigation via email, including a list of multiple policy violations that could lead to termination, improper detention failure, to establish reasonable, suspicion discourteous treatment, and potential civil rights violations. Additionally, the message indicated that the district attorney's office was conducting its own review of possible criminal charges related to civil rights violations. His police union representative called shortly after advising him to remain silent and let them handle his defense. Say nothing to anyone about this. Not fellow officers, not friends, not social media, the rep instructed firmly before adding off the record. This one's bad, Mike. The DA's office has resources and motivation we can't match. We'll do our best, but you need to prepare for the worst. As Calhoun processed these developments, the doorbell rang, revealing an unexpected visitor, Pastor Marcus Green from Oakwood Community Church, where Calhoun occasionally attended with his family. The middle-aged black minister stood on the porch with a concerned expression, rather than the condemnation Calhoun had come to expect from everyone outside his immediate family. "Thought you might need someone to talk to, Pastor Green," said simply when invited inside. Their conversation in Calhoun's kitchen avoided both empty reassurances and harsh judgment. Instead, the pastor asked Calhoun a question that would linger long after the visit. "Do you want to defend what you did, or do you want to understand why you did it?" This gentle but direct challenge became a turning point, as Pastor Green encouraged Calhoun to examine the underlying beliefs that had led to his actions. "You're not the first officer to make this mistake, and you won't be the last if nothing changes," he said, his tone compassionate but unflinching. "But change starts with honest reflection, not just damage control." Meanwhile, at Westridge Academy, Jasmine and Zoe returned to school to find themselves suddenly at the center of attention. Some teachers and students expressed genuine support and outrage at their treatment, while others displayed uncomfortable curiosity or performative allyship that felt almost as dehumanizing as the original incident. The school administration, concerned primarily about their reputation, offered platitudes about inclusivity, while subtly pressuring the twins to handle the situation discreetly. This pressure intensified when the girls were called to Headmaster William Prescott's office during third period, where they found their parents already waiting. The headmaster, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually concerned expression, sat behind his massive desk as he expressed rehearsed concern about the incident, before hinting that the publicity was disruptive to the Pfizer educational environment. Victoria immediately recognized this attempt to silence her daughters and responded with measured precision. "My daughters were racially profiled in their school uniforms, a block from campus. If that's not relevant to their educational environment, I don't know what is." Her calm but firm response left the headmaster backpedaling, suddenly emphasizing the school's full support for the Bennett family. Have you ever witnessed someone in authority try to minimize discrimination instead of addressing it directly? Comment number 1. If you believe institutions often care more about their image than actually protecting the people they serve, hit that like button if you admire Victoria's refusal to let her daughters be silenced for the sake of institutional comfort. Subscribe to follow this powerful story of accountability and systemic change. What do you think will happen to Officer Calhoun now that his actions have been exposed? Will the police department take meaningful action, or will they try to protect their own at the expense of justice? And how will this incident affect the Bennett twins as they navigate the sudden spotlight thrust upon them? Stay tuned as our story continues with the internal investigation that will reveal just how deep the problems go in the Oakwood Police Department. As evening approached on this tumultuous day, the story shifts between three perspectives that establish the far-reaching impact of a single police encounter. Calhoun, sitting alone in his home office, surrounded by commendations and photos from his police career, wondering how it all went so wrong so quickly. Victoria Bennett, in her downtown office, methodically building a case that extends beyond one incident to address systemic issues throughout the department, and the twins in their bedroom, creating a thoughtful social media post that articulates their experience and calls for accountability rather than merely punishment. These parallel moments establish that the incident's repercussions are just beginning to unfold for everyone involved, with consequences that will extend far beyond one officer's career or one family's experience to potentially transform an entire community's approach to policing and racial justice. 3 days after the incident, Calhoun sat across from Internal Affairs Captain Washington in a sterile conference room at police headquarters. the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the table between them. Unlike the aggressive interrogation Calhoun had expected based on his experiences on the other side of such investigations, Washington's approach was methodical and factual, making the evidence against him all the more damning through its objective presentation. "I'm going to play your body camera footage in its entirety," Washington explained, his expression professionally neutral, as he opened a laptop. "I want you to watch it without commentary first, then we'll discuss specific moments." What followed was excruciating for Calhoun, seeing his behavior without the filter of his own perceptions, the footage revealing subtle details he hadn't registered in the moment, how he approached the twins with his hand near his trained weapon despite no indication of threat, how he interrupted them repeatedly while they tried to explain, how his tone changed when speaking to white bystanders who attempted to intervene, how he dismissed clear evidence contradicting his assumptions. Washington paused the video. At the moment, Calhoun claimed the twins' school IDs must be fake. "Walk me through your thought process here," he requested, his tone conversational but penetrating. Calhoun shifted uncomfortably in his chair, struggling to articulate what had seemed so obvious to him in the moment. "They just didn't look like Westridge students," he finally admitted immediately, recognizing how damning the statement sounded. "I mean, the uniforms seemed real, but I thought maybe they'd acquired them somehow, or—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought without revealing the underlying assumption that he couldn't believe black teenagers from this neighborhood could afford such an exclusive school. Washington nodded slightly, allowing the uncomfortable silence to stretch before continuing. "So, you assumed they couldn't be students there based on what exactly?" The pointed question forced Calhoun to confront his biases directly. After several false starts, he finally acknowledged, "I guess I assumed they couldn't afford the school, that they didn't belong in that neighborhood." Washington then presented data from Calhoun's patrol history that he hadn't known was being compiled. He had stopped black pedestrians at 8 times the rate of white pedestrians in Hillcrest, despite the neighborhood's demographics. Similar patterns emerged in vehicle stops and suspicious person reports. Calhoun had never seen these statistics analyzed, and appeared genuinely shocked, attempting to justify the pattern with references to criminal profiles and instinct developed over years of policing in high-crime areas. "Is it possible," Washington asked carefully, "that your instinct has been shaped by biases you haven't examined?" This question hung in the air between them, its implications extending beyond this single incident to Calhoun's entire approach to policing. Before he could formulate a response, Washington introduced additional evidence, 5 previous complaints of racial profiling against Calhoun from his former precinct, all dismissed without thorough investigation. The pattern was undeniable, especially when contrasted with his record of rarely stopping white civilians for similar minor infractions or perceived suspicious behavior. "This isn't just about the Bennett twins," Washington concluded as the interview wound down. "It's about a pattern of behavior that the department can no longer ignore, regardless of what happens with this specific case." Across town, Victoria Bennett met with her investigative team in the conference room of her office, the walls covered with whiteboards, documenting not just Calhoun's history, but departmental data, showing disparate treatment of minorities throughout Oakwood's police force. Civil rights attorney Ayanna Jackson, whom Victoria had brought in specifically for this case, reviewed the materials with practiced efficiency. "Calhoun's pattern is concerning," she noted, "but what's more troubling is how the department handled previous complaints. The system protected him until he targeted someone who could fight back effectively." Victoria nodded in agreement, her focus broader than many expected, from someone whose children had been directly affected. "Calhoun isn't an anomaly," she explained to the assembled team. "He's a symptom of systems that protect and perpetuate bias. I want accountability for my daughters, but I also want structural change. Otherwise, we're just addressing one officer while leaving the conditions that created him intact." Ayanna nodded in agreement, but played devil's advocate. "The police union will fight this tooth and nail. They'll claim it was an isolated incident, not a systemic problem. They're already shaping the narrative in some media outlets." Victoria smiled grimly, her expression reflecting years of experience navigating political resistance to meaningful reform. "That's why we're gathering evidence that proves otherwise, and why we need to approach this strategically, not emotionally. Build a case so solid they can't dismiss it as political revenge or parental outrage." Meanwhile, the Bennett twins navigated their unexpected role as symbols in a larger movement. At school, they found themselves alternately treated as heroes or victims, rarely as the normal teenagers they'd been just days earlier. During lunch period, a well-meaning white classmate approached their table with enthusiastic suggestions. "You should totally speak at the student rally next week," the girl insisted, her expression earnest. "You could use your platform to raise awareness." Zoe, typically more direct than her sister, responded firmly, "We're not your social justice project. We're still processing what happened to us." The classmate's shocked expression revealed she hadn't considered the twins' perspective, only how their experience could serve her activism. Jasmine, typically the more diplomatic twin, softened the response slightly. "We appreciate support, but we'll decide how and when to share our experience. Everyone wants us to educate others about racism when we're still dealing with what happened." Later that day, the twins met with Dr. Renee Carter, a trauma counselor who specialized in racial trauma. Victoria had insisted on these sessions not because she thought her daughters were fragile, but because she understood the cumulative impact of racial stressors, especially when magnified by public attention. In this safe space, the girls expressed feelings they'd kept contained: fear beneath their composed exterior during the incident, anger at having to maintain perfect behavior, while being humiliated, and frustration at now being expected to educate others about racism. "Everyone keeps saying how articulate and composed we were," Jasmine said bitterly during their session, "as if we deserved basic respect, only because we didn't fit their stereotype of angry black teenagers. What if we had been scared and shouted or cried? Would people be defending us then?" Dr. Carter validated these feelings while helping them develop strategies for maintaining their well-being amid ongoing attention. "Your story matters," she told them, "but so does your healing. You get to set boundaries about how and when you engage with others about your experience." Back at the police department, Chief Reynolds met with Sergeant Rodriguez to discuss broader implications of the Calhoun case. Reynolds, nearing retirement after 35 years on the force, had spent decades trying to reform the department from within, often compromising more than he'd like to maintain his position of influence. This incident could undo years of community relationship building, he admitted, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose tiredly. "But it could also be the catalyst for changes I've been pushing for, that always get blocked by the union or the city council. Sometimes it takes a crisis to create opportunity for real reform." Rodriguez, younger and less willing to accept incremental progress, pushed back. "With respect, Chief, we shouldn't need a high-profile incident involving a DA's children to address problems we've known about for years. How many complaints have been filed by people without power or connections who never got justice?" Their conversation was interrupted by an alert on Rodriguez's phone. The police union had scheduled a press conference without department approval. They watched with growing concern as the union representative stood before cameras portraying Calhoun as a dedicated officer being sacrificed to political correctness and anti-police sentiment. "Officer Calhoun has served this community with distinction for 18 years, the rep declared. One interaction taken out of context during a time when police are under unprecedented scrutiny shouldn't erase a career of service. The union's aggressive stance forced all parties to harden their positions. By evening, battle lines were clearly drawn, the police union defending Calhoun as a scapegoat for broader tensions, the DA's office pursuing accountability and reform. Department leadership caught in between competing pressures, and the Bennett twins at the center of a controversy they neither sought nor could escape." The part ends with Calhoun returning home after his grueling internal affairs interview. He finds his son Dylan in his bedroom, carefully removing a proud police family sticker from his laptop. When Calhoun asks why, Dylan responds without looking up, "Because I don't know if I am anymore." This personal rejection hits Calhoun harder than any professional consequence, forcing him to confront how his actions have affected not just his career, but his family's identity and his relationship with his son. The realization that he might lose his son's respect permanently creates an emotional urgency that departmental punishments never could, setting the stage for genuine reflection rather than mere damage control. 1 week after the incident, Calhoun sat in Pastor Green's office at Oakwood Community Church, staring at a coffee mug, growing cold between his hands. The past 7 days had stripped away his certainties, leaving him in unfamiliar territory, questioning beliefs and behaviors he'd never examined before. The pastor had offered his office as neutral ground for a meeting. Calhoun had never expected Dr. James Bennett, father of the twins and husband of the district attorney, had requested a private conversation. Calhoun had initially refused, assuming the meeting would involve threats or demands, but Pastor Green had convinced him of its potential importance. Sometimes understanding requires direct conversation with those we've harmed, the pastor had said. Doctor. Bennett arrived precisely on time, his tall frame filling the doorway momentarily before he entered, and took the seat across from Calhoun. His calm demeanor betrayed no hint of the anger he must feel, his white doctor's coat exchanged for a casual but expensive sweater that indicated he had come directly from his cardiology practice at Oakwood Memorial Hospital. After brief, tense introductions facilitated by Pastor Green, the men sat in uncomfortable silence until Dr. Bennett finally spoke. "My daughters had nightmares after your encounter," he began, his voice controlled and measured. "Not their first, unfortunately. Black children learn early that authority figures might see them as threats rather than people deserving protection. We've had conversations about how to survive police interactions since they were 12 years old." Calhoun started to offer a defensive response about police procedures and split-second decisions, but Pastor Green's subtle headshake stopped him. Instead, he forced himself to listen, as Dr. Bennett continued. "I'm not here to shame you, Officer Calhoun. I'm a cardiologist. I've spent decades watching people refuse to acknowledge warning signs until they're facing a crisis. Then suddenly they're willing to make changes they should have made years ago." He leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "You're having a professional crisis. The question is whether you'll use it as an opportunity for genuine change or just try to weather the storm until you can go back to business as usual." This unexpected approach, neither accusatory nor absolving, created space for a different kind of conversation than Calhoun had anticipated. Dr. Bennett shared stories of his own experiences with profiling, including being detained in the parking lot of the hospital where he was chief of cardiology because he was matching the description of a suspect. He described the constant calculations black professionals make to appear non-threatening in white spaces, from how they dress to how they modulate their voices, and the exhausting vigilance required to navigate systems designed without them in mind. For perhaps the first time, Calhoun truly listened without preparing counter-arguments or justifications in his mind. When Dr. Bennett asked what led to his suspicion of the twins, Calhoun began, with rehearsed procedural explanations, but gradually moved toward painful honesty. "I didn't consciously think about their race," he admitted, after several minutes of conversation. "That's what's been hardest to face. I didn't recognize my assumptions because they felt like facts, not beliefs. It wasn't a decision so much as an automatic reaction. They didn't fit what I expected Westridge students to look like, so they must be lying." Dr. Bennett nodded, his expression reflecting recognition of a pattern he'd seen countless times. "That's how implicit bias works. You don't have to be a hateful person to perpetuate harmful patterns. The system trains us all to make certain assumptions, but it's particularly dangerous when those assumptions come with a badge and a gun." This conversation marked a turning point in Calhoun's understanding of the situation. Rather than focusing solely on defending his actions or preserving his job, he began the more difficult process of examining the mentality that led to his behavior in the first place. He started to see his policing career through a different lens, recognizing patterns he'd previously justified as good instincts or proactive policing. Meanwhile, Victoria Bennett met with Chief Reynolds in his office at police headquarters to discuss department-wide reforms. Unlike the adversarial approach many expected given her personal stake in the situation, Victoria presented data-driven recommendations for policy changes, training improvements, and accountability measures. "I could pursue maximum punishment for Officer Calhoun," she acknowledged, her tone professional rather than personal. "That would be politically expedient and personally satisfying, but if nothing systemic changes, we're just sacrificing one officer while leaving the underlying problems intact. My daughters would still have to fear the next Officer Calhoun they encounter." Reynolds, who had faced resistance to reform efforts throughout his career, saw an unexpected ally in Victoria. "Most people in your position would want blood," he observed, studying her carefully across his desk. "I've seen plenty of officials use incidents like this to advance careers rather than solutions." Victoria's response was measured. "I want justice. Sometimes that looks like punishment. Sometimes it looks like transformation. Ideally, it's both. But purely punitive approaches without structural change just create martyrs and resentment, not lasting improvement." Their discussion expanded beyond Calhoun's case to address departmental culture training deficiencies and accountability systems. Victoria proposed civilian oversight with actual authority mandatory bias training, with measurable outcomes and revised use of force policies. Reynolds, seeing the opportunity to implement changes he'd long advocated for, cautiously agreed to work with her on developing these proposals, while navigating the inevitable political resistance they would face. At home, the Bennett family continued processing their experience differently. Jasmine immersed herself in research about police reform, considering a future in civil rights law like her mother. She compiled statistics and case studies approaching the incident analytically as a way of maintaining emotional distance. Zoe channeled her emotions into art, creating powerful visual representations of the incident and their aftermath, images that captured the fear, anger, and ultimately resilience they had experienced. Their different responses sometimes created tension between the typically unified twins, with Jasmine occasionally finding Zoe's artistic expression too emotional, while Zoe considered Jasmine's research disconnected from the human. Impact. During dinner, when Victoria mentioned her meeting with Chief Reynolds and their discussion of departmental reforms, Zoe challenged her approach. Why are you helping them fix their image? They should be held accountable for what they did to us. Her voice carried the hurt that statistics and policy discussions couldn't address. Accountability without change is just vengeance. Victoria responded calmly, I want both. But vengeance alone doesn't protect the next black teenager who encounters a biased officer. Dr. First Tem Bennett mediated the family discussion, helping them navigate their different perspectives while maintaining their strong bonds. He reminded them that they could support each other, even when processing trauma differently, and that their varied responses represented strength rather than division. The scene shifts back to Calhoun's home, where his family dynamic had significantly changed since the incident. His wife Elena had moved from shock to deep disappointment, not just in his actions, but in his initial failure to take responsibility for them. His son Dylan maintained emotional distance, spending more time away from home and responding to questions with minimal engagement. The teenage boy who had once proudly told friends about his police officer father now avoided the topic entirely, his silence more painful to Calhoun than any argument could be. During a tense family dinner, Elena finally confronted the elephant in the room. Have you actually apologized to those girls? Not because you have to for your job, but because you understand what you did wrong. The directness of the question caught Calhoun off guard. His reflexive defensiveness rose, then subsided as he considered the question honestly. No, he admitted, setting down his fork. I've been too focused on the consequences to my career, on what might happen to me. Maybe that's the problem, Dylan interjected, unexpectedly breaking his days-long silence. You keep talking about what this means for you. What about what it meant for them? This simple observation from his son cut through Calhoun's remaining self-justifications. Later that night, he sat at his desk and wrote a letter to Jasmine and Zoe Bennett, not asking for forgiveness or trying to explain away his actions, but simply acknowledging the harm he caused and taking full responsibility. Whether he would actually send it remained undecided, but the act of writing forced him to articulate truths he had been avoiding since the incident. The part ends with parallel scenes of reflection, Calhoun reading departmental policies on bias and profiling that he had previously dismissed as political correctness, now seeing them with new awareness. The Bennett twins sharing their artistic and research projects with each other, finding common ground in their different processing styles, and Victoria working late into the night on reform proposals, pausing to look at childhood photos of her daughters on her desk, recommitting to creating a world where they wouldn't be defined by others' perceptions. These quiet moments of introspection set the stage for the more public confrontations to come as personal growth begins to translate into external action. 2 weeks after the incident, tensions in Oakwood reached a breaking point. The police union had hardened its stance, portraying Calhoun as a victim of political correctness and mobilizing officers to resist proposed reforms through work slowdowns and media campaigns, questioning the department's leadership. Community activists, frustrated by what they perceived as insufficient consequences, had organized daily protests outside police headquarters, their chants of "no justice, no peace," creating a constant backdrop to departmental operations. Social media amplified both extremes with hashtags like #StandWithCalhoun and #Defund Oakwood Police, trending locally, further polarizing the conversation and leaving little room for nuanced discussion. Against this volatile backdrop, a community forum was scheduled at the Oakwood Civic Center for Wednesday evening. Originally planned as a constructive dialogue between police leadership and residents about improving relations, it had transformed into something more charged with various factions planning to use it as a platform for their competing agendas. Hours before the forum, Calhoun met with his union representative Sean Murphy in a coffee shop several blocks from the venue. Murphy, a former officer who had transitioned to full-time union work, laid out their strategy with the confidence of someone accustomed to managing police misconduct allegations. "We've prepared a statement for you," he explained, sliding a folder across the table. "It emphasizes your service record, expresses appropriate regret without admitting specific wrongdoing, and redirects attention to the anti-police climate, making officers' jobs increasingly difficult." He tapped the folder with satisfaction. "We've got at least 30 officers attending in plain clothes. They'll applaud at key moments, ask supportive questions. The narrative is you're being railroaded to appease political pressure." Calhoun reviewed the statement with growing discomfort. His conversations with Pastor Green and Dr. Bennett had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of the situation, making the union's standard defense strategy feel inadequate and even dishonest. "What about the actual mistake I made?" he asked, looking up from the carefully crafted non-apology. "Shouldn't I acknowledge that I acted on assumptions that weren't justified by any objective facts?" Murphy dismissed this concern with a wave of his hand. "Absolutely not. Any admission becomes ammunition. We're fighting for your career here, Mike. Save the soul-searching for after we've secured your position." Meanwhile, at the Bennett home, Victoria and her daughters discussed whether to attend the forum. Jasmine wanted to go, seeing an opportunity to advocate for meaningful change and put faces to the statistics she had been compiling. "People need to see that this isn't just about policies and procedures," she argued. "It's about real people whose lives are affected." Zoe was reluctant, anticipating a circus atmosphere that would further exploit their experience without producing results. "They'll just use us as props," she warned. "Everyone will say the right things publicly, then go back to business as usual once the cameras leave." Victoria considered both perspectives along with the strategic implications of their presence or absence. "If we don't go, others will speak for us." She reasoned her prosecutor's mind, evaluating the situation from multiple angles. "If we do go, our presence might overshadow the systemic issues at stake. We need to decide what message we want to send." After further discussion, they ultimately decided all three would attend, but remain observers unless directly addressed, allowing community members without their platform or privilege to lead the conversation. They would not announce their attendance beforehand, preferring to enter quietly rather than creating a media spectacle. The forum began predictably at 7 o'clock with the large auditorium nearly filled to capacity. Chief Reynolds opened with a carefully worded statement about the department's commitment to improvement, followed by prepared remarks from community representatives chosen for their moderate views. The discussion quickly deviated from this scripted start, however, as audience members raised pointed questions about specific incidents and patterns. Community activists demanded immediate action, firing Calhoun, implementing civilian oversight, and redirecting police funding to social services. Union representatives defended officers' difficult position, arguing that a few high-profile incidents were being used to demonize all police. City council members offered political compromises that satisfied nobody. The discussion grew increasingly heated, with speakers talking past each other, rather than engaging constructively, each side playing to their base, rather than working towards solutions. From their seats midway back in the auditorium, the Bennett family watched this performance with growing frustration. Victoria recognized political theater when she saw it. Everyone making statements for their constituencies rather than having the difficult conversations necessary for real change. The twins exchanged glances as speaker after speaker referenced their experience without addressing the underlying issues that had created it. The dynamic shifted when Calhoun was invited to speak approximately an hour into the forum. The union had carefully orchestrated this moment with supportive officers strategically positioned throughout the audience, prepared to amplify key points from his statement. As he approached the microphone at the front of the auditorium, Calhoun felt the weight of expectation from multiple directions, the union expecting him to follow their script, the department watching to see if he would inflame tensions. Further, the community waiting to judge his sincerity or lack thereof. Standing before the diverse crowd, including many black residents whose experiences with police had been consistently negative, Calhoun made a decision that would alter the trajectory of not just the forum, but his entire approach to the situation. He put aside the prepared statement and spoke from a place of uncomfortable truth. "I've spent 2 weeks trying to explain why I did what I did," he began hesitantly. "To my superiors, to internal affairs, to my family. I've cycled through every justification. I was following procedure. I was acting on instinct developed through years of experience. I was being cautious in an uncertain situation." The audience grew still as they realized he was deviating from the expected script of denial and minimization. But the truth is simpler and harder to admit. "When I saw 2 young black women in Hillcrest, I automatically assumed they didn't belong there. When they told me they were Westridge students, I automatically assumed they were lying. When they behaved with perfect composure, I interpreted it as defiance." Union representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, attempting to catch his eye with warning glances he deliberately ignored. "I didn't recognize these as assumptions based on race because they felt like facts. That's what bias does. It presents itself as objective reality when it's anything but. I'm not standing here asking for forgiveness or for my job back. I'm acknowledging that I caused harm through actions I didn't even recognize as biased at the time." The room erupted with mixed reactions. Stunned silence from fellow officers who felt betrayed by this deviation. From the Union strategy, murmurs of surprise. From community members who had expected defensiveness rather than accountability. And a ripple of cautious appreciation from black residents who rarely heard such direct acknowledgement from law enforcement. From their seats, the Bennett twins exchanged glances of surprise. Victoria studied Calhoun carefully, her expression revealing nothing as she assessed the authenticity of his unexpected accountability. "Have you ever witnessed someone take full responsibility for their actions when they could have made excuses instead?" Comment number 1. If you believe genuine accountability is the first necessary step toward real change. Hit that like button if you think Calhoun's honest recognition of his bias took more courage than continuing to deny it. Subscribe to follow this powerful story as it continues to unfold, revealing how one incident can transform individuals and institutions. Do you think Calhoun's acknowledgement will lead to meaningful reform, or will entrenched systems resist change despite his personal growth? And how might the Bennett twins respond to this unexpected turn of events? The forum devolved into chaos as different factions responded to Calhoun's statement. Union representatives attempted damage control, community activists questioned his sincerity, and police leadership tried to maintain order while processing this deviation from the anticipated script. Some officers walked out in protest, while others remained visibly uncomfortable but present. In this charged atmosphere, Jasmine Bennett made an unexpected decision. Despite their agreement to remain observers, she found herself standing and moving toward the microphone during the open comment period. The room fell silent as she introduced herself. Many present knew who she was, but hadn't heard directly from either twin since the incident. "I didn't ask to become the center of this conversation," she began quietly, her composed voice carrying through the suddenly attentive audience. "My sister and I were simply walking home from school when Officer Calhoun decided we didn't belong in our own neighborhood." She described the experience from her perspective, not with anger but with painful clarity, that forced listeners to truly hear what it means to be profiled, to have your identity questioned, to be treated as inherently suspicious because of your skin color. "What happened to us isn't unique," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "The only unique part is that our mother happens to be in a position where people have to listen. Most black teenagers who experience this don't have that advantage. Their stories don't make the news. Their trauma doesn't spark community forums." Her composed delivery made the content even more powerful, the restraint in her voice highlighting, rather than diminishing, the injustice she described. She concluded by addressing the various factions directly. "This isn't about whether Officer Calhoun keeps his job. It's about whether any of you are actually willing to change the conditions that made his actions seem normal to him until he got caught." As Jasmine returned to her seat, Zoe squeezed her hand in silent support. Victoria watched with pride and concern, proud of her daughter's eloquence, but worried about the public scrutiny she had invited. The forum ended without resolution, various groups retreating to their corners with hardened positions. But something had shifted in the conversation. Calhoun's unexpected accountability and Jasmine's powerful testimony had moved the discussion beyond simplistic narratives of villain and victim toward the more complex reality of systemic problems manifested through individual actions. The part ends with 3 perspective scenes: Calhoun facing furious union representatives who believe he has sabotaged their strategy, Victoria fielding calls from media outlets seeking interviews with Jasmine, and the twins in their bedroom, Jasmine second-guessing her decision to speak publicly while Zoe reassures her, "You spoke your truth. That's never wrong." These closing moments highlight the continuing tensions between institutional resistance and individual growth, setting the stage for the more structural changes to come. 3 days after the community forum, Victoria Bennett sat in her office reviewing the final draft of what her team had dubbed the Oakwood Initiative, a comprehensive proposal for police reform that went far beyond Calhoun's individual case. The thick document included specific policy changes, training requirements, accountability mechanisms, and community oversight structures, all supported by data and precedents from successful implementations elsewhere. Each recommendation addressed issues revealed by the twins' case, while connecting them to broader patterns affecting the entire community. Her chief of staff, Marcus Williams, stood by the window overlooking the courthouse plaza, his expression reflecting concern about the political risks involved. "The police union will fight this tooth and nail," he warned, turning to face her. "City council members in conservative districts will claim it undermines public safety." "Are you sure you want to stake your political capital on this? The next election is only 18 months away." Victoria's response was measured but firm. "This isn't about politics, Marcus. It's about using a moment of heightened attention to create lasting change. My daughters won't be the last black teenagers wrongfully detained if the system remains as it is." She closed the binder containing the proposal. "Besides, sometimes the right decision politically is doing what you promised voters you would do. Create a justice system that works for everyone, not just those with power and privilege." Across town, Calhoun faced professional isolation following his unscripted comments at the forum. Fellow officers who previously offered support now avoided him in the department hallways, some viewing his public acknowledgement of bias as betrayal of the thin blue line. His union representative had bluntly informed him they wouldn't continue fighting for his job after he threw them under the bus by deviating from their strategy. The internal investigation continued, with terminations seeming increasingly likely, his career prospects diminishing with each passing day. In this professional wilderness, Calhoun found unexpected purpose. Having finally acknowledged his biased actions publicly, he began examining other aspects of his policing career with new perspective. He spent hours reviewing his arrest records, use of force incidents, and complaint history, seeing patterns he previously dismissed as coincidental or justified. This self-examination was painful but clarifying, the first step toward genuine change rather than performative apology, designed primarily to protect his position. Pastor Green continued meeting with Calhoun, regularly providing space for this difficult introspection without judgment or easy absolution. During one session in the pastor's office, Calhoun admitted a realization that had been haunting him. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if they weren't the DA's daughters. I would have processed them for resisting or providing false information to a peace officer, and everyone would have backed me up. How many times have I done that without consequences? How many lives have I affected based on assumptions I never questioned?" This recognition led Calhoun to a difficult decision. He contacted Captain Washington at Internal Affairs, requesting a meeting without his union representative present, an unusual and potentially risky move for an officer under investigation. When they met in the same sterile conference room where his formal interview had occurred, Calhoun provided detailed information about problematic practices he'd witnessed and participated in throughout his career: racial profiling, tactics disguised as proactive policing reports, sanitized to justify questionable stops, and the informal code that discouraged officers from reporting colleagues' misconduct. Washington listened with increasing concern, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing Calhoun to speak uninterrupted. When the officer finally finished, Washington leaned forward. "You realize this could expand the investigation beyond just your case. Other officers will be implicated." His tone suggested both respect for Calhoun's honesty and awareness of its potential consequences. "They should be," Calhoun responded simply, "including my past self." Meanwhile, at Westridge Academy, the Bennett twins continued navigating unwanted attention. Some teachers and students had become awkwardly deferential, treating them with kid gloves rather than engaging normally. Others seemed to expect them to educate the community about racism, to become spokespeople for an experience they were still processing themselves. The administration, concerned primarily about the school's image and donor relationships, had organized a hastily planned diversity assembly that felt more performative than substantive, featuring generic statements about inclusion, without addressing specific practices that marginalize students of color. During lunch period, Zoe expressed frustration to her sister. They're using what happened to us to make themselves feel better without actually changing anything. That assembly was basically racism is bad for 60 minutes, with no concrete actions. This observation sparked an idea that the twins developed over the following days, a student-led initiative to address institutional bias at Westridge. Rather than a one-time assembly or symbolic gesture, they proposed ongoing discussions, curriculum reviews, and policy changes, addressing specific issues they and other minority students had experienced. Their approach focused on systemic transformation rather than performative gestures mirroring their mother's work at the city level. When they presented their proposal to Headmaster Prescott, he responded with political caution, concerned about potential pushback from conservative parents and donors who might view such initiatives as too progressive. "We need to be careful not to make white students feel attacked or blamed," he explained, his fingers forming a steeple beneath his chin. "Perhaps we could focus on diversity appreciation rather than examining institutional practices." Zoe responded with the directness that characterized her. "Respectfully, sir, that's exactly the problem. You're more worried about white discomfort than black safety. Appreciating diversity means nothing if the institution itself treats some students differently than others." This exchange became a turning point for the twins' advocacy at school. Rather than relying on administrative support, they built a coalition of like-minded students and sympathetic faculty to implement changes from within. Their initiative gained momentum as students from various backgrounds recognized how institutional bias affected everyone's educational experience, not just minority students, creating environments where conformity was valued over creativity and where questioning established practices was discouraged regardless of identity. The scene shifts to City Hall, where Victoria presented the Oakwood Initiative to Mayor Harold Peterson and key city council members in the mahogany-paneled conference room adjacent to the mayor's office. Peterson, a moderate politician, concerned primarily with re-election rather than legacy, received the proposal cautiously. "This is comprehensive," he remarked, after flipping through the executive summary, his tone suggesting this wasn't necessarily a compliment. Some might say overreaching. The budget implications alone would require significant reallocation of resources. Victoria had anticipated this reaction. "It's data-driven and evidence-based," she countered smoothly. "Every recommendation addresses specific patterns we've documented through both qualitative and quantitative research. And I've already secured tentative support from Chief Reynolds for the core reforms." This last point surprised the politicians who had expected a more adversarial approach from the DA's office toward the police department. Victoria had strategically built alliances with reform-minded officers and leadership isolating resistance to the most problematic elements within the department, rather than creating a simplistic police versus community narrative that would be easier to dismiss. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that Victoria had meticulously prepared for every objection. When Councilman Richards claimed the proposals would hamper officers' ability to fight crime, she presented data showing departments with similar reforms actually improved crime clearance rates by building community trust and cooperation. When budget concerns were raised, she outlined how reduced misconduct settlements would offset implementation costs. Her most persuasive argument came when addressing public safety concerns. Effective policing requires community trust. Right now, large portions of our community don't trust the department to treat them fairly. That doesn't make anyone safer. Not residents, not businesses, not officers themselves. These reforms aren't anti-police. They're pro-effective policing. While Victoria navigated political waters, Calhoun received notice that the internal investigation had concluded. He was called to a meeting with Chief Reynolds, Captain Washington, and the department's legal counsel. The formal atmosphere suggested the outcome wouldn't be favorable to his continued employment, a reality he had come to accept. Reynolds began with unexpected candor. "Officer Calhoun, your actions during the Bennett incident violated multiple departmental policies. The investigation found clear evidence of racial profiling, improper detention, and failure to follow verification protocols. Calhoun accepted this assessment without argument, having already acknowledged these failures publicly and to himself. Reynolds continued his tone, shifting slightly. However, your subsequent cooperation with internal affairs, including information about systemic issues within the department, has been noted. This doesn't excuse your actions, but it does factor into our response. The chief slid a document across the table. Not termination papers, but a different kind of proposal. Calhoun read it with growing surprise. Instead of standard termination, the department was offering an alternative. Calhoun would resign from his position, but work with the training division to develop bias recognition and prevention programs based on his experience. His case would become a required case study for all officers, and he would participate in community reconciliation efforts. To be clear, Reynolds emphasized you would no longer be a sworn officer. But your experience, both the failure and your subsequent recognition of it, could help prevent similar incidents. Calhoun looked up from the document, momentarily speechless at this unexpected direction. "Why would you offer this instead of just firing me?" Captain Washington answered, "Because termination alone doesn't fix the underlying problems. We need institutional memory of mistakes to avoid repeating them. Your perspective as someone who recognized biased policing from the inside has unique value, if you're willing to use it constructively." The part ends with all major characters considering transformative proposals that go beyond individual punishment or vindication. Victoria, with her comprehensive reform initiative, the twins with their school-based advocacy, and Calhoun, with an unexpected opportunity to convert his failure into prevention. Each approach addresses systemic issues, rather than merely resolving the specific incident that brought them into conflict, suggesting the possibility of more fundamental change than initially seemed possible. These parallel developments create momentum towards structural reforms while acknowledging the complexity of institutional transformation, processes that require sustained effort rather than simple solutions. 1 month after receiving the department's proposal, Calhoun stood before a class of 20 police cadets at the Oakwood Police Academy. His new role felt strange. No uniform, no badge, no authority, except that granted by his experience and newfound perspective. The cadets watched him with mixed expressions, curiosity, skepticism, and the wariness that comes from knowing his story through media coverage and departmental gossip. "I'm not here to tell you I was a bad cop," he began, avoiding the scripted introduction the department had suggested. "For 18 years, I was what the department considered a good cop. High arrest numbers, proactive patrol, minimal complaints that stuck. I received commendations and regular promotions." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "That's the problem. The system rewarded behaviors that seemed effective, but caused immeasurable harm to communities I claimed to serve. Today we're going to examine how good policing can perpetuate injustice when it's built on unexamined biases." Over the next 2 hours, Calhoun guided the cadets through his encounter with the Bennett twins, using body camera footage and his own commentary to highlight decision points where bias influenced his actions. He didn't minimize his responsibility or offer excuses, instead demonstrating how seemingly instinctive police work often reflects deeply ingrained stereotypes about who belongs, where, and which civilians deserve the benefit of the prost doubt. He explained how confirmation bias led him to interpret the twins' composed responses as attitude and their factual statements as lies, because these interpretations confirmed his initial assumption that they didn't belong in Hillcrest. This session represented Calhoun's contribution to the reforms gradually being implemented throughout the department. Although he had initially struggled with the loss of his identity as an officer, he was finding unexpected purpose in this new role, helping future officers recognize and counteract the patterns he had followed for years without questioning. The cadets' responses varied, some defensive, others thoughtfully engaged, but none could dismiss the power of seeing such a concrete example of how bias operates in real-time decisions. Across town, Victoria Bennett presented quarterly progress reports on the Oakwood Initiative to the Civilian Oversight Board, established as part of the reforms. The implementation hadn't been smooth. Resistance from the union budget constraints and political maneuvering had slowed certain aspects, but measurable changes were taking root throughout the department and community. 6 months ago, we identified disparities in enforcement actions across different neighborhoods. Victoria explained, showing comparative data slides to the diverse group of community representatives. Initial metrics show a 20% reduction in these disparities, while maintaining appropriate response to actual criminal activity. The board members asked challenging questions about sustainability and deeper cultural change. Would these improvements last beyond the initial scrutiny, or would the department gradually revert to previous patterns once public attention moved elsewhere? Victoria acknowledged these legitimate concerns. Policy changes create the framework, but transforming culture takes longer. That's why the training components and accountability mechanisms are critical. We're not just changing what officers do, but how they think about their role in the community. After the meeting, Victoria was approached by Sergeant Rodriguez, who had become an unexpected ally in implementation efforts. The officer's initial skepticism about politically motivated reforms had evolved into genuine commitment as she observed their positive effects. Some officers still resist, Rodriguez admitted as they walked toward the parking lot. They see accountability as a threat rather than a protection, but others are seeing benefits they didn't expect. Response times are actually improving in minority neighborhoods as residents become more willing to engage with officers. Cooperation with investigations has increased now that people believe reports will be taken seriously. This incremental progress felt simultaneously encouraging and insufficient to Victoria, who understood that systems resistant to change for decades wouldn't transform overnight. Her professional pragmatism sometimes conflicted with her maternal instinct for immediate protection. She wanted a world that was already fair for her daughters, not one slowly becoming less unfair. At Westridge Academy, the Twins Initiative had evolved into a formal student equity council with faculty advisors and administrative recognition. Their approach had matured from righteous indignation to strategic advocacy, identifying specific policies and practices that disadvantaged minority students and proposing evidence-based alternatives. They had learned to navigate institutional resistance by building coalitions and documenting patterns that couldn't easily be dismissed as isolated incidents. During a council meeting, Jasmine presented research on disciplinary disparities within the school. Black students are 4 times more likely to receive suspensions for subjective infractions like disrespect or attitude problems, while white students more often receive warnings for the same behaviors. We've compiled 3 years of discipline records showing consistent patterns that can't be explained by actual conduct differences. The council, which included students from various backgrounds and grade levels, developed recommendations for more objective disciplinary standards and teacher training on recognizing implicit bias. Their work created sometimes uncomfortable but necessary conversations throughout the school community, with some faculty embracing the opportunity for growth, while others resisted what they perceived as accusations. Zoe had focused on curriculum development, challenging the limited representation of diverse perspectives in course materials. "We're not asking to throw out traditional texts," she explained to a skeptical department chair. "We're asking to expand the conversation to include voices that have been systematically excluded. Literature classes that only present white perspectives on the human experience aren't preparing any students for the world they'll enter after graduation." Their advocacy had not come without personal costs. Some students avoided them, uncomfortable with conversations about privilege and systemic inequity. Certain teachers seemed to grade them more harshly, perhaps unconsciously resistant to being taught by students. The twins sometimes disagreed about tactics and priorities, testing their typically unified approach to challenges. Despite these difficulties, they were developing leadership skills and resilience that would serve them long after graduation. Their parents noticed this growth during family dinner discussions, where the twins increasingly contributed sophisticated analysis of institutional systems rather than focusing solely on individual actions. Meanwhile, Calhoun's family continued adjusting to their new reality. Financial pressures mounted with his reduced income in his non-officer role. Elena took extra nursing shifts to compensate, creating strain on their marriage, already tested by the public humiliation of the incident. Dylan remained distant, processing his complex feelings about his father's actions and their consequences. During a rare moment of connection while working on Dylan's car together, Calhoun attempted to bridge the gap. "I know this has been hard on you. Kids at school giving you a hard time." Dylan tightened a bolt with unnecessary force before responding. "Some. Mostly I give myself a hard time, trying to figure out what to believe now." "What do you mean?" Calhoun asked, passing a wrench when Dylan extended his hand without looking up from the engine. "You taught me police protect people. That if people just follow the rules, they don't have problems with cops." He finally met his father's eyes. "Now I'm trying to understand a world where that's not true for everyone." where following rules doesn't guarantee safety if someone decides you don't belong somewhere. This honest exchange marked tentative progress in their relationship, as Dylan began seeing his father not as either hero or villain, but as a flawed person capable of both harmful actions and genuine growth. The conversation opened possibilities for rebuilding trust based on truth, rather than idealized perceptions. The various reform efforts faced significant test when a new incident occurred. Another officer detained a black teenager in circumstances paralleling Calhoun's encounter with the twins. This time, however, the recently implemented protocols resulted in rapid de-escalation and supervisor intervention before the situation escalated. Body camera footage was reviewed immediately. The officer was placed on administrative duty, pending investigation, and community liaisons were notified transparently. Most significantly, the department publicly acknowledged concerns about the stop's justification rather than automatically defending the officer's actions. This measured response demonstrated the potential effectiveness of the new systems, though Victoria and other advocates recognized that one properly handled incident didn't represent comprehensive change. Still, it provided evidence that intentional reforms could create different outcomes, reinforcing their commitment to the difficult ongoing work of transformation. The part ends with a chance encounter at a local coffee shop between Calhoun and Dr. Bennett. The men acknowledge each other with cautious nods, neither planning to engage until Dr. Bennett unexpectedly approaches Calhoun's table after getting his order. "My daughters tell me you're working with police cadets now," he says, neither friendly nor hostile. Teaching about what happened, Calhoun nods uncomfortably, trying to make some good come from my mistakes. After a moment's consideration, Dr. Bennett offers a perspective that captures the complexity of their situation. Accountability isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different one. This encounter symbolizes the gradual shift from the immediate crisis of the incident to the longer journey of systemic change. Not neat resolution, but ongoing commitment to different choices and sustained reform efforts by all involved. 1 year after Officer Calhoun handcuffed the Bennett twins on a Hillcrest sidewalk, a commemoration ceremony took place at Oakwood City Hall. The event wasn't celebrating the incident itself, but marking the reforms implemented in its wake. The Oakwood Initiative, now recognized as a model program drawing interest from departments nationwide, had resulted in measurable changes in police-community relations and enforcement disparities. The marble lobby of City Hall had been transformed with rows of chairs facing a podium filled with community members, city officials, media representatives, and police officers, some supportive of the changes, others present out of obligation. The ceremony brought together figures from throughout our story, their relationships and perspectives transformed by the events of the past year. Victoria Bennett approached the podium to address the gathered audience, her characteristic precision evident in both her appearance and her words. Systems resist change until crisis creates opportunity. 1 year ago, my daughters experienced what countless black teenagers face without the platform or privilege to demand accountability. Today, we're not celebrating that incident, but rather the community's response to it, choosing transformation over temporary outrage. She outlined the initiative's accomplishments with data, rather than rhetoric, comprehensive bias training for all officers, civilian oversight, with actual authority, revised use of force policies, and transparent disciplinary procedures. Large screens displayed statistics showing decreasing disparities in enforcement actions while maintaining public safety metrics, evidence countering critics who had claimed reforms would increase crime rates or hamper police effectiveness. This work isn't complete, Victoria acknowledged, surveying the diverse audience. Institutional change happens gradually with persistent effort and constant vigilance. But we've demonstrated that meaningful reform is possible when we move beyond blame to address underlying systems. What matters now is continuing this work long after public attention has moved elsewhere. As Victoria spoke, we see reactions from various characters whose journeys we've followed: Chief Reynolds nearing retirement, and satisfied that his department was finally implementing changes he had long advocated for. Sergeant Rodriguez now heading the newly created Community Relations Division that implemented many of the reforms. Captain Washington, whose Internal Affairs unit now had the authority to pursue misconduct investigations without interference, and Mayor Peterson, initially reluctant, but now taking partial credit for reforms that had improved his administration's standing with diverse constituencies. After the ceremony, the Bennett family gathered at home for a more private commemoration. The twins, now high school seniors preparing for college, reflected on how the incident and its aftermath had shaped their paths. Jasmine had been accepted to several prestigious universities with plans to study law and public policy, her research into police reform having evolved into a passion for systemic justice. Zoe, whose artistic expression of their experience had gained unexpected attention from galleries and online platforms, would attend a renowned art institute to develop her visual storytelling focused on social justice themes. Sometimes I still get angry thinking about that day, Jasmine admitted during their conversation around the dining table, but mostly I'm proud of what came from it. The Student Equity Council is established now. The curriculum changes are permanent. Freshmen won't have the same experience we did. Zoe nodded in agreement, but added perspective. True, but we had resources and support many don't have. I keep thinking about all the kids who get profiled without cameras recording, or powerful parents to advocate for them. This awareness of both progress and persistent inequality characterized their developing worldview, neither naively optimistic nor cynically dismissive of the possibility for meaningful change. Dr. Bennett, who had been relatively quiet during public aspects of the reforms, focusing instead on supporting his daughter's recovery and his wife's more visible work, shared his perspective. When I was your age, I thought change meant completely transforming systems overnight. Now, I understand it often happens incrementally through persistent pressure at multiple points. What matters is that the pressure remains consistent. Victoria, typically focused on next steps rather than celebrating achievements, allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. You two turned an injustice into a catalyst. That's the most powerful response possible. Across town, Calhoun attended his son Dylan's high school graduation. Their relationship had slowly healed over the past year, though not returning to its former uncomplicated state. Instead, they developed more honest communication with Dylan, asking difficult questions about policing, race, and justice, and Calhoun responding without defensive justifications. The ceremony held particular significance as Dylan announced plans to study criminal justice in college, not to follow his father's original path into policing, but to pursue reform work focusing on restorative justice practices. This direction had emerged from their family's experience transforming personal crisis into purposeful commitment. After the ceremony, Calhoun reflected on his journey with Elena as they waited for Dylan to finish taking photos with friends. His role at the police academy had evolved from simply sharing his cautionary tale to developing comprehensive training on bias recognition and intervention. Though no longer a sworn officer, he'd found unexpected fulfillment in helping shape a new generation of police who might avoid his mistakes. A year ago, I thought losing my badge was losing my identity, he admitted watching his son across the crowded auditorium lobby. Now I realize I'm having more positive impact than I ever did making arrests. Elena, who had supported him through the darkest periods of self-recrimination while never excusing his actions, responded with hard-earned wisdom. Sometimes we need to lose what we thought defined us to discover who we actually are. The story's final sequence brings unexpected closure through a carefully arranged meeting at Pastor Green's church. The Bennett twins, now high school graduates preparing for college, had requested to speak with Calhoun before leaving for school in the fall. Their parents supported this decision, but allowed them to meet independently, recognizing their daughter's agency in addressing their own experience. When Calhoun arrived visibly nervous despite the months of personal growth, he found Jasmine and Zoe waiting in the church garden. Their composed demeanor reminded him of their dignity during the original encounter, but now they met as individuals with equal standing rather than officer and suspects. After an initially awkward exchange, Jasmine explained their purpose. "We wanted to talk with you directly before we leave for college, not for closure or forgiveness or anything symbolic, but because the systems only change when the people in them change." Zoe continued their clearly coordinated approach. "Our mom has been working on policy. Our dad focuses on community healing. We've been advocating at school. But we realized we never actually spoke with you personally after everything that happened." Calhoun listened attentively, having learned the value of hearing others' perspectives without immediately formulating defenses or responses. The conversation that followed wasn't dramatically emotional or filled with either recrimination or absolution. Instead, it was thoughtfully reflective, with all three acknowledging the complexity of systems that shaped their encounter and its aftermath. The twins shared how the experience affected them personally, beyond the public narrative. Calhoun described his evolving understanding of how his actions represented larger patterns rather than isolated mistakes. "I won't say I'm grateful for what happened," Jasmine concluded as their conversation wound down, "but I value what came after. Not just policies changing, but people changing, including us." Zoe added the perspective that captures the story's central theme: systems don't change unless the people within them change first. As they prepared to leave, Calhoun asked if they'd considered speaking to his cadet classes sometime, not to rehash the incident, but to help future officers understand impacts of their actions from the perspective of those affected. The twins exchanged their characteristic glance of silent communication before Jasmine responded, "Maybe. Not now, but sometime. That's actually why we wanted to meet, to keep the door open for future conversation rather than seeing this as a closed chapter." Have you ever witnessed a moment when an incident of injustice ultimately led to positive change? Comment below sharing your experience with transformative justice or a time when accountability created growth instead of just punishment. Like this video, if you believe that systems can change when people within them have the courage to acknowledge mistakes and work toward improvement. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that explore complex social issues with depth and nuance. And please share this video with someone who might need to see that even painful encounters can sometimes lead to unexpected healing and progress. Thank you for joining us on this journey from confrontation to transformation, showing how one incident can ripple outward to affect individuals, institutions, and entire communities. Remember, as Zoe said, systems don't change unless the people within them change first. This story reveals powerful truths about racial bias in America's institutions. First, discrimination doesn't require conscious hatred. Unexamined biases often masquerade as instinct or experience, making them particularly dangerous when coupled with authority. Second, accountability must extend beyond individual punishment to address systemic issues. Removing one officer without changing the conditions that shaped his behavior merely creates space for the next incident. The story also teaches us about transformation. Real change requires uncomfortable honesty about our biases and the courage to examine beliefs we've never questioned. It demands both personal responsibility and collective action, individuals acknowledging harm while institutions implement structural reforms. True justice isn't about vengeance, but creating systems that prevent future injustice. Perhaps most importantly, this narrative reminds us that those most affected by discrimination shouldn't bear responsibility for fixing broken systems. The Bennett twins didn't ask to become symbols in a larger movement, yet their experience catalyzed change because of their mother's position. Countless others face similar discrimination without such resources or platforms. Finally, we learn that meaningful change happens gradually through persistent effort rather than dramatic moments. The most powerful transformation occurs when people within systems recognize problems and commit to addressing them, not when external pressure forces temporary compliance. What experiences have shaped your understanding of bias in our institutions? Have you witnessed a moment when accountability led to genuine growth rather than just punishment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe in the power of both personal and systemic transformation, hit that like button to support more stories that explore complex social issues with depth and nuance. Subscribe to our channel